Hey guys, how's it going? It's Jay, and today I got the Nikon ZF, and we're going to go over this camera beginner's guide style. So this is a great video for those that are new to the Nikon system, specifically the Nikon ZF, which is a very powerful street style, rangefinder style camera. So it has a lot of dials and buttons. It's a very tactile camera. It's got really good build quality, and it's pretty fairly large and heavy as well. So we're just going to go over this thing inside and out. I'm going to go over the camera body first, then we're going to turn the camera on. I'll show you how to set it up. All right guys, so I just want to give a shout out to BH Photo, who was kind enough to let me borrow the Nikon ZF so I can make videos like this for you guys. So it'd be cool if you guys check them out as well in your spare time. If it wasn't for them, I wouldn't be able to make this video. So thanks again, BH Photo, and let's get into it. First of all, congratulations on your new camera. This thing really is awesome. So in the box, what you get is a USB-C cable. So it's a USB-C to USB-C. There is no charger, like wall charger, that came with the camera, just to let you know. Next up, we have the battery here. So this is the battery, has a nice little protective cover on there. You just got to take that off, and you can see here's the electrical contacts. And then of course we have the camera strap. Now the camera strap you can take out, and it weaves through these little camera strap holders here. So you can put that on if you want. I'm not going to put it on right now because it gets in the way when I'm doing this tutorial, but I do highly recommend putting a camera strap on of some sort. So many camera strap options out there, but you don't want to drop this camera, and the grip on this camera is not really that good as far as, you know, grabbing the camera. Alright, so first thing we're going to want to do is get this sucker charging, so let's get the battery in there. Alright, so looking at the bottom here, you got the 1/4-20 tripod plate. You also have the other hole here for different tripod plates, so it'll keep the tripod plate from spinning, basically. Now over here we have the battery door, and notice how this door automatically locks, which I really like. Auto-locking door. Wish all cameras had that. Now here is where the battery goes. You could see there's like a little cheat sheet there telling you which way to put it in. And basically it's going to go like this, and just like pretty much every other camera, there's a lever there that is actually holding the camera down, and then when you push it, it'll spring up. Now as far as memory cards go, we need to get a memory card in there, and this is the memory card I've been using lately. This is the ProGrade V90. It's an excellent card. SanDisk makes great cards as well, Lexar and so forth. So I'll leave a couple of links below. I would recommend getting whatever's on sale. But because this camera does have really high bitrate codecs in there, I would recommend getting a V90 card. Now, you don't necessarily need that for taking photos, just to let you know, but it will clear the buffer faster if you're taking rapid fire shots, if you have a faster card. It'll also transfer the photos and videos off the camera faster with a faster card, so keep that in mind. So the memory card's going to go in like this. You just push that down, and that's spring loaded, so when you click it again, it will then pop up, and you could grab it and take it out like so. So we got the main SD card slot here, and then we have the micro SD card slot here. So this is a dual slot design, and you can see this little cheat sheet again will kind of show you the two slots with the SD and the micro SD, and then of course the battery there. And now watch the auto closing door. Gotta love it. So now what I want to show you is the USB port on the side, because I want to get this thing charging. So you can see here we have these nice rubber doors, so we got some really good weather sealing on this camera. So notice up there, there's a little CHG. That's a charging light, and that will light up when we plug in the charger. So I just have a PD power source here. So it's just a wall charger with a USB-C cable, very similar to the cable that came with the camera, except like I said, this is plugged into the wall. So I'm just going to plug it into the USB-C port, and you should see that light up, letting you know that it is now charging, and there it is. And you know, in a perfect world, that light should go out when the battery is fully charged. So I'm just going to unplug this for now. And while I'm over here, let me show you this other door. So we got the microphone jack here, we got the micro HDMI here, and above that we have the headphone port, and then of course the USB-C port for file transfer and charging and stuff like that. So I really like these rubber doors, how they seal. They are a little bit hard to get back on, but not too hard like worth complaining about, but the seal is what's very nice. So definitely don't have to worry about water getting in there. Alright guys, so now that we got the battery in there and theoretically we have the camera charging, if you guys are following along, just, you know, follow along and make sure your camera's charging while we're doing this. That would be my recommendation. So what we're looking at on the top here, we have the ISO dial. So this is the camera sensor sensitivity. And right now it is set to C mode, which means the camera is going to control it. So you can adjust it on the camera, or you can use these dials. So it has a lock button here, and it unlocks when you're going through all the different ISO settings. But when you get back to C, it locks. And you just have to unlock it with this button to turn it, like so. So that's pretty much having the camera control the ISO. Like I said, you could use the dials, or you could let the camera do it on the back, and you can adjust it using the command dials and stuff, which is kind of how I prefer to use it. But if you're a rangefinder style user, you're probably going to want to use this in full manual mode, which I totally understand. And why wouldn't you when you have a camera that has all these tactile, feedback dials and everything? It's pretty awesome. So over here on the left-hand side, you have the modes, and there's actually a switch for that right here. It's like a toggle switch, and you can see with my thumb how I'm changing the modes with that toggle switch. It's kind of hard to see because everything is black. It's a little bit dark there. Now I'm going to keep it in auto mode for now because this is a beginner's guide. So I'm going to start with the camera in auto, then I'm going to build from there, and we'll go into the other camera modes. But I always like to start in auto for those beginners out there that just want to get shooting immediately and might not necessarily know how to use manual mode, for example. So you could skip ahead if you're a more advanced user, of course. So this right here is the focal plane indicator. So that is where you would measure from. If you need to measure for minimum focus distance, for example, doing macro photography and so forth, that is where the sensor plane is. Now right here is the monitor selector. So you can actually push this. This is a button right here. And that will change between the viewfinder and the screen, and it'll also change to different priority options. You could make it so it's only the viewfinder, or you can make it so it's only the monitor, for example, and the LCD screen is considered the monitor, just so you know. We also have stereo mics here on the left and the right. There's like these little holes. They're kind of hard to see. Right there, you can see it right there. There's one of them. There's another one on the other side. So that is your stereo microphones. Now we also have the hot shoe on the top here where you can put flash units and stuff like that. You can also put an on-camera mic and things like that in there. Now over here we have the shutter speed dial, and right now it's set to 1/3 step, which means you could basically control it on the camera and it'll go 1/3 of a stop as you turn the command dial for shutter speed. So again, it's kind of like auto mode for shutter, controlling it on the camera. This has the same lock mechanism as the ISO dial over here. So it's locked on 1/3 stop, and it also will lock on X, which stands for flash sync speed. So if you're using a flash, you can set this to X, and that will sync the shutter speed to the flash sync speed to ensure proper exposure and stuff like that. And notice how it's locked on the X as well. So you can turn it to T, which stands for time. Now time is a more advanced feature. You do have to be in manual mode to use the time function, but how that works is you just press the shutter button down, and then the counter will start counting, and then you just press the shutter button again when you're done. So that's like a timed exposure. Now it's also locked in that, so you have to hit this button, and now it's in bulb mode. Bulb mode works very similar to time mode, except you have to actually hold your finger on the shutter for bulb mode. So bulb mode just requires you to hold it, and then when you let go, the exposure is done. The bulb mode is also locked, so I'm going to turn this to unlock it. And now we have just your regular shutter speed option. So you have 4 seconds, 2 seconds, 1 second, and so forth. You can go all the way around here. We can get to fractions of a second, and then it locks when we get back to 1/3 stop. Now there's another mode dial here, which will switch between photo, black and white. So you can see black and white photo, regular photo, or video mode. So this is like a sub dial to select the camera mode. So I'm just going to leave it in photo mode for now, but that's what this sub dial does underneath this shutter. Now, of course, we have the on and off toggle here. So that's on, off, and then we have a shutter button here, which is a very nice feedback on all these dials and buttons, by the way. The shutter button is a 2-stage button, so you can press it halfway to focus, and then you can press it all the way down to take the photo. We also have a video record button right here, so you can start and stop recording video right there. We also have a control panel here, which shows the aperture value by default when you're in aperture priority mode, and this can also be used for special exposure modes. If you're doing really long exposures, you can set in the menu there to count down, for example. It'll be like a counter. Now this dial here is the exposure comp dial, so you can manipulate the camera's exposure plus or minus using that, which is quite nice. Or you can set it to C mode, as well and control that on the camera if you prefer. Now I just want to give you a little bit closer view of this grip here because there's really not much of a grip. You can see there's a little bit there, but honestly guys, it's not enough. You need more of a grip. This camera weighs so much that this just isn't enough of a grip in my opinion. Even with your finger underneath, it's hard to hold, and I notice I keep hitting this button by mistake as well. I actually disabled this button. This was white balance by default, so I actually disabled it because I kept hitting it by accident trying to hold this thing. My fingers were just like sliding and stuff. So I highly recommend getting a grip for this. There's a grip I found on Amazon. It's like $36 or something like that. Made by SmallRig. It'll bump the grip out significantly, as you can see here. In addition, that grip attachment comes with an Arca Swiss on the bottom, which kind of looks like this. And that's super convenient for tripods that have the Arca Swiss head. Like this Freewhale tripod, by the way, which I recently reviewed. It's an awesome option. You could also do it with the mini tripod like this Lefoto right here, which I use. This I carry with me everywhere, but this is an Arca Swiss type top, and you can see how it has those angles. All right, guys, so looking at the back, you have the main command dial here. And again, very good feedback. It's pretty hard to turn this dial, so you're not gonna really be turning it by accident too much. Over here, we have the eyepiece release button. That's what that is right there. So you could take the eyepiece off if you want to clean it or whatever. We have the playback menu. We also have the garbage can over there, which acts as a delete button. Up here, we have the viewfinder eye sensor. So when you put your eye up, it'll sense it and switch to the viewfinder automatically. Over here, we have the auto exposure lock and the auto focus lock, and it's also the protect photo button when in playback mode. It'll add like a little lock next to your photo so you won't accidentally delete it. This is your diopter, I believe it's pronounced. You adjust this for your vision, and it'll adjust how the focus is for the viewfinder. So if you wear glasses like me, you might need to adjust this. Now over here, this is a little light that lights up when the memory card is being accessed. So when the camera's writing files to the memory card, that will light up right there. Now this, we have a multi-selector here, which, you have various directions. You could use this to navigate the menu, and then you have an OK button in there as well. You got a display button, which will change the way the screen displays. So you have your zoom in for zoom magnify, and also to zoom in on photos when in the playback menu. Same thing with the zoom out. This is also a question mark, so when in the menu, this will give you more information for a given feature if you press that button. That's why there's a question mark there. And then, of course, you have the menu button. Now, up here, you have the I menu, which is very similar to the Q menu on Canon cameras or the function menu on Sony cameras. So basically, it's like a little sub menu that'll pop up on the bottom, and it'll give you like quick access to key features like focus area, focus mode, metering mode, facial recognition, on and off, things like that. And it'll be different depending on what mode you're in. So if you're in video mode and you hit the I menu, you're gonna have different options than you would when in photo mode. Then of course we have this really nice monitor. So if we open this up, you can see the monitor over here. Now this is a touch monitor. I'll show you that more when we turn the camera on, of course, but I just wanted to show you how it swivels around so you can use this camera in selfie mode like so. If you need to know the serial number and stuff, it's right here underneath the screen. And of course you can close the screen this way and have the screen out. However, I highly recommend leaving it the other way, especially when putting it in your camera bag and stuff like that, so this way the screen does not get scratched. All right guys, so looking at the front of the camera, we have another sub command dial. So this is like the secondary command dial. You have a custom button over here, which by default is white balance. You have the lens release over here. That's what this is. You also have this AF illuminator lamp, which also acts as a self-timer countdown. It'll blink. This also acts as the red eye reduction when using a flash. Now, underneath this cap is this sensor. So if you're new to Nikon cameras, this actually rotates the opposite way compared to the Canon and Sony cameras that I mostly use, so it's a little weird to me, but if you're used to Nikon, you're gonna be used to that. So you just turn it and you can take that off, and there is the full frame sensor. Now, note this lock pin. You can see the pin going up and down. See that steel pin? That's what locks the lenses on. So let me show you how to mount a lens. I got this 24-200 here, which is a really nice lens. Let me just show you how to mount this up. You can see that white dot right there on the top of the lens. Well, there's a white dot right here on top of the flange. See the white dot on the flange? So we're just gonna marry up those white dots, and then we're gonna twist this, and you could hear it lock. You could hear it lock. So now I can't get the lens off because it's locked. To get the lens off, I have to release it with this pin here. So now if I hit that, now I can take it right off. Let me just throw that back on. There we go. So now that I have the lens mounted, I just wanted to show you, take off the lens cap, and that's what the front of the lens looks like. We have the lens hood here. I recommend putting the lens hood on. It will help protect if you accidentally bang the lens in front of something or whatever. Now, if you guys aren't familiar with lenses, this is a zoom lens, so you are going to need to turn it to zoom. It doesn't zoom automatically, so you got to turn it like so. This lens also has a lock feature here, which is quite nice, so it won't zoom if you don't want it to. And this is the focus ring for this lens. So the secondary ring is for focus. All right, guys, so it's time to turn the Nikon ZF on. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take this lens hood off because I'm going to flip the camera up. But let me just turn this on. So we got this lever here. Put it to the on position. Now this is what you can expect to see when you first turn it on. Now I just wanted to go over this very quickly here. So we have a touch shutter button over here. We have the camera mode up here. It tells you what the viewfinder is set to. That's this button over here we talked about before. So we have single shot drive mode and we have autofocus single, which is what it's currently set to. Now up top we have white balance. It's set to A1, just auto 1. You can actually have presets for your white balance, favoring warm or cool depending on what you want to do. Extremely powerful camera here. And then on the top right we have basically it's like the creative mode or the style, so that's also set to auto. Below that we have the type of format that we're set to. Right now we're set to normal JPEG. It says FX there because we're in full frame mode. Now that eye right there is the eye menu, which you can hit this button right here, or you can actually touch it and it'll bring it up, as you can see here. Hit it again and it'll go away. Then we got battery life. Then of course we have ISO. We have how many photos we could take. That's the room left on the memory card. And this is going to be your shutter speed, and this is your aperture number right there. And over here on the bottom left is your metering mode. So if we swivel this out, also note when you put your eye up to this, you can see when I cover the sensor, how the TV turns on. It looks like a little TV in there. All right, guys, so I have it in full auto mode. And you can see right here on the top left, it says it's in auto mode. And basically, all you got to do is point and shoot. So here's the shutter button. I can just point and take the photo, or you can just touch, because touch shutter is enabled by default. If you look at this little icon right here. Now you can change that to off, so it doesn't do anything when you touch. It's up to you. Some people might want that off. You also have the option to just move the focus point around. So if you touch around, it'll move the focus point like so. And then when you focus, it'll actually try to focus the camera. If you go one more time, you have touch AF. So now if you touch, it will focus where you touch. And then the last option is touch shutter, as you can see there. Now the ISO by default is in auto, but you can turn it and manually set it. So now it's set to 100, you can see there. So you can override it, but by default, I usually leave that on the C option on the dial. Now I just wanted to show you, I did change the image quality. If you go right here to image quality, I have it set to RAW plus JPEG fine. And these are all the other options, so depending on what you're doing. I usually use RAW plus JPEG because it's nice to have the processed JPEG files and then the RAW images as well if I want to process them myself. So that's up to you. You can select that in here. There's a lot of different options. And then we have image size settings. So I have it set to large. You can go in here and you can take medium if you want to get more photos, for example. And pretty much everything else is grayed out in here in this main area because we're in full auto mode. So again, you can see here it's focusing on the eye. And by default, if we use this directional option on the back, the directional pad, you can go right and left. And notice now it's focusing on the right eye because I just changed it. So you can change it right and left just by using this directional pad. I love this feature. I wish more cameras had it because it's very convenient to be able to change the eye so easily. On other cameras like the Sony cameras, you have to program it to a custom button or whatever. So it's doable, it's just, this is by default ready to go. Now check out this little eye button here. See that little button with the eye? That's the same as the button on the back with the eye. And if you press it, it'll bring up this menu. Now, these are pretty much the key options that you can change when in full auto mode. So you are limited. You could see the JPEG size, image quality, white balance you cannot change, picture control you cannot change. AF area you can change. Now, AF area is a very important feature. AF area controls how much of the sensor is going to be active for like autofocus. So basically you could limit the amount of the sensor area for autofocus, and that's what this feature does. This is extremely important because depending on what you're shooting, sometimes the camera will focus on other stuff and you need to limit the focus. The easiest way to do that is to just touch where you want it to focus, but sometimes that's not that easy either. It just isn't working for whatever reason. So if you go in here, you can change your area. Let me go over here and show you the wide large. So this is the wide large area. This is a really good option that I would probably use most of the time. So this will limit the autofocus area to that red box. So inside that red box. So it's not going to focus on anything outside that box. Again, very helpful if you're using facial recognition and you only wanted to pick a face that's in the center of the screen. This is a good way to limit it, you know? I highly recommend playing with this. Now over here you have these really tiny ones. So this is pinpoint. So you could see there that one red dot. So this is going to be super accurate. It's just using that one little tiny dot for focus. And I used this the other day when I was focusing on a flower. The camera it was having a hard time, so I switched it to point, and boom, I was able to get the shot I wanted very quickly. So that's what focus area mode does. Now, if you look down here, this is the subject detection. Now, this also limits as to what the camera will or will not focus on, because it'll prioritize subjects if you have this feature enabled. So by default, this is going to prioritize all these different subjects. So you can just hard set it to like humans, cats and dogs, cars, airplanes, or you can turn it off. Now, why you would want to have this off is because if you're trying to focus on like a product or something you're holding up in front of the camera, you want to turn the facial detection off, and then it'll focus on whatever's closest to the camera by default. If there's facial recognition turned on, for example, even if you have something held up in front of the camera, it's still going to prioritize the face. So that's why you may or may not want to turn this off. I'm just going to leave it on auto for now. Now this next option over here is the focus mode. So AFS stands for autofocus single shot. And what that means is, let me change my focus mode back to the large area. Let me go here. I'm just going to go to the large area there. All right, so now it's going to focus on the face. You could see the eye there lighting up. So watch when I lock the focus. There's a green box there. Now I can turn the camera. You see how that green box stayed? And I took the shot over there. So that's what AFS does. It'll focus and then lock, so you can now reframe your scene. A lot of times you might want to take a picture of a portrait and then reframe it to get something else in the scene, you know? That's what's really cool about AFS. Now watch when I change that to AFC. So now AFC, you could see the green box doesn't come up, but the focus is staying on the face. So it's tracking the face. It's continuously autofocusing. That's what AFC does. And that's basically how video works. It's just continuously autofocusing. Although video actually has another mode, AFF for full-time autofocus, which is, I recommend using that for video. But again, if we go into the menu here, let me just put this back to, let me show you what manual focus does. Manual focus will allow you to just turn this ring here. And you can see it coming up there on the bottom. It shows you like for the distance, close to infinity and so forth. And if you hit the magnify zoom button, it'll zoom in and make it much easier to manually focus. And zoom in even more. Now watch when we turn this. Now we could dial it in really easy. See that? It's right about there. And you can see down here when that circle comes up, it'll show you accurate focus. When that circle's there, that's how you know you got it perfect. And it'll tell you, it'll like give you an arrow as to which way you need to rotate the lens, which is really cool. And that's how that works. So that's manual focus. Let me put it back to AFS. By the way, you can touch these as well and it'll bring you in. So this is the release mode. And by default, it is set to single frame, which means it'll just take one shot. But you can set it to continuous shooting like this here. And notice there's an arrow there, meaning if you go down, there's more options. So right now it's set to 5 frames per second. And watch what happens when I take the photos now. It's taking 5 frames per second. See that? So that's how that works. And you can change it to high speed plus, so that's going to be really fast, as you can see there. And then you have 30 frames burst. So you can select that if you want, and it'll take 30 frames. And then you have self timer here. And again, if you go down, you have different options for the self timer. You can also change the amount of shots you take. Very cool, very powerful. I like that a lot. This is great for family portraits. You can set it, like say 10 seconds, take 3 shots, and then set the self timer. I'll set it to 5 for now, so we don't have to wait so long, but watch. You can see the self timer blinking. And there's the 3 shots. So that's how self timer works, and you can dial in the number of shots you take as well. Now guys, when in auto mode, if you turn this sub dial here, by default, it's going to change the exposure compensation, and you can see that on the screen here on the very right side of the screen. Whoops, I just touched. See how I had just touched, so now that tracking box is up, or the autofocus? If you hit the center button, the OK button, it'll go away and reset the settings. So now it'll reacquire the face, as you can see there. But anyways, this dial here, the sub command dial, you can see the exposure's going up, and now it's going down. So you have exposure control. Even though you're in full auto mode, you can still manipulate it up or down if you need to. Sometimes the scene might be too bright or too dark. You can control it there. The rear control dial also controls the exposure comp when in full auto mode. So if we hit the playback button here, we can go into the playback menu, and you can zoom in by hitting the zoom in and zoom out features. And if you keep zooming out, it'll go into these different display modes so you can see more photos. You can scroll through all of them. You can see I took a bunch here doing this testing. So let me show you how program auto mode works a little bit differently. So now I'm in program auto mode, and notice how it's set to ISO auto. So let me go into the menu here and show you the ISO settings really quick. So right here is ISO sensitivity settings. So I can turn it off right here. See how it says auto ISO sensitivity on? This is where you can go and turn that off. If I turn that off, now you can see the camera is locked at 100. So I would have to change the ISO by turning this dial on the top, and now the ISO is changing. When it's on the C mode though, it won't change now. So you have to actually have auto ISO enabled in the camera. So if I go back in the menu there, turn that on, and you can also change the minimum shutter speed. If you go in here, notice this. You can actually lock it down to a minimum shutter speed of like 1/1000th of a second, for example. So now you can see I have 1/1000th of a second at 5.6, and it's ISO 40,000 is required for that shutter speed. So even though I'm in program auto, I have all this power where I can actually lock the shutter speed into 1/1000th of a second using that feature for the ISO minimum shutter speed right here. So let's just put that back to auto. And then here is the second stage of that ISO sensitivity settings. So this is where you can control the default shutter speed. So right now it's at 0. So if we look at the shutter speed, let me put this back to auto. All right, so right now you can see it's at 1/50th of a second. So that is the default speed that it's choosing at 50 millimeter in this situation, sitting on a desk. Now watch when I change the zoom. So now we're at about 30 millimeter, and it's choosing 1/30th of a second. See that? You can zoom in even more. So you can see the shutter speed is automatically changing with the focal length of the lens. And that's how this works by default. But you can override that a little bit. So 1/50th is like the slowest you're gonna want it for hand holding, let's say, at 50 millimeter. So watch what happens if we go in here and just click auto, auto. Now we can go faster. So let's go +1. See how the shutter speed went to 1/100th of a second? So this is just going to give you, in auto mode, a little bit faster of a shutter. So if you have shaky hands, or the subject is moving a little bit and you need a little bit faster of a shutter or a little bit slower of a shutter, this is where you can go and manipulate that. I love this feature. I use it all the time on the Sony cameras. Now again, if we go even faster, watch, it's going to be 1/200th of a second now. See that? So this is just a great way to manipulate the auto shutter speed when in program auto mode. So you can't do this in full auto mode, but program auto gives you the power to do this. So let me just go back and set that back, and I'll show you how you can make it slower as well, like -2, for example. Now I got 1/13th of a second, which in this scene is fine. Watch. See, perfectly sharp, nothing's moving. So for lower light scenarios, this is great, especially if nothing's moving. You can get a much lower ISO and cleaner images. The lower the ISO, the cleaner the images are going to be. And also don't forget if you change this because your shutter might be too slow or too fast or something because you changed it. So 0 is a good place to leave it just at default. 1/50th is pretty good if you have steady hands and you're using, a lens with VR, vibration stabilization plus the sensor stab. You can hand hold with pretty slow shutter speeds nowadays with all this new stabilization technology. All right, guys, so I just wanted to show you in the eye menu here. We have a couple new features now that we're in Program Auto that have been unlocked. So we have set picture control. So in here, you can set your picture control. They have a bunch of different presets. You can go in here and play with those if you want. A lot of options. Holy cow, there's so many. I'm just going to put it back to auto for now. And then we have white balance. So you can go in here and you can change your white balance. You have auto 1, 0, 1, and 2 for the keep overall atmosphere. You got reduce warm colors, warm lighting. You can go in here and you can change it to natural light auto. So you can see how it is changing the white balance. It looks a little bit warmer, a little bit more natural. I kind of like this option better. And you can go through here and hard set your white balance if you want. You can go all the way down to Kelvin here and you can choose your color temperature. If you go down, it'll give you the option to dial in the color temperature. See how there's a little down arrow under the K there? And now here is your presets. So you can go in here to set custom white balances. You got D1 through 6. So you can have 6 custom white balances in there, which is quite nice. I'm going to put it back to A1 there. Now the other option here I just wanted to show you is stabilization. You have off, on, and sport mode. So this actually was an option in auto mode. I forgot to show you. So sport's just going to be a little bit better if you're hand holding while walking with the camera and stuff. Custom control shooting, you can go in here and you can change some stuff. Right now this is set to white balance, this button on the front of the camera. So if I press it, you can see white balance comes up and then you can use the command wheel to change it. So if you go in here, I can actually set this and turn it off. So I'm going to set that to off. And the reason I'm setting it to off is because when I'm hand holding this camera, I keep hitting this button by accident and it's driving me crazy. All right, so before we go any further, I just want to put it back into auto mode and I wanted to switch it to video mode here so you can see what it looks like when recording video. So this is video mode now and we have it set for 4K 24 10-bit. I can show you those settings in the menu here. Alright guys, so when it comes to selecting your video file type, if you go in here, this is where you have the different options. Now I'm using the 10-bit option because it's the best quality, but if you go over to the right one more, you have the option for HLG, which is the hybrid gamma, and then you have N-Log. So N-Log is just like shooting log, like on the Sony cameras, S-Log 3. It's called N-Log on the Nikon cameras. Now my buddy Josh is like an expert when it comes to this more advanced video type stuff. So he made an entire video on shooting N-Log with Nikon cameras and stuff. So I'm going to link that below in the description area for those log shooters. But because this is a beginner's guide, I'm not going to cover shooting log in video because that's in my opinion, more advanced feature. That would be like an advanced user guide type situation. And then I have it set to 4K at 24p. That's where those settings are. That's all I did was change those. And now if we hit the record button right here, you can see it's now recording. And you can just touch around the screen and it will focus. It'll try to focus if there's enough light to wherever you touch. And then to cancel that, you can just hit the OK button and it'll default back to the non-touch autofocus. And then you could stop recording. And there you have it. That's how it works in video mode. Then you have black and white mode as well. So it's just putting it into a black and white option, which is very cool. So again, you're going to have more power with Program Auto. So if we put it in P mode, now we're in Program Auto and we're set to black and white on the dial here. If I go into the eye, you could see we have monochrome. And there's a couple different monochrome options that we can choose from now. So again, a lot more power when in Program Auto versus regular auto. Let's just put it back into photo mode. All right, so now we're going to go up to shutter priority mode. Now, this is the shutter dial here, but because it's set to 1/3 of a stop there, you can control the shutter by this using the rear command dial. The front sub command dial is still going to control exposure compensation, but you can see here I'm manipulating the shutter speed. And notice the ISO is changing automatically to maintain the proper exposure. So that's what auto ISO does. So I can turn auto ISO off in the menu if I want to control ISO with the dial here. But like I said, sometimes it's easier to just use the exposure comp if I want to make it a little darker or a little brighter, and just leaving it on auto. Because remember, I'm just dialing in the shutter speed. So if I'm shooting sports, for example, I'd want it at like 1/500th of a second. Just as an example, that's how shutter priority works. You can slow the shutter way down if you want, all the way to right about there, ISO 100. So we can keep slowing it down, and now it'll change. We're out of ISO, it can't go any lower, but what it can do is it can change the aperture diaphragm and make it smaller, which is going to increase the time. So we can get up to 4 seconds, 5 seconds. Looks like we can get to like 13 seconds at f32 here using shutter priority mode. Alright guys, so I got the Nikon ZF set up here in the lab, and I have the shutter speed set to 1 second, and I also have it set to shutter priority mode. And you can see that on the top left here, shutter priority mode. In addition, I just wanted to show you, I have the self timer set for 2 seconds. So what I want to show you is how shutter speed can capture motion. So because I have it set to 1 full second, when I spin this, take the photo, it's going to capture the motion. Because remember, the exposure is open for 1 full second. So that was able to rotate several times. You can see right there how it captured the motion. Pretty sweet, right? So now watch when we raise the shutter speed up. So let me put it at like 1/500th of a second. So you can see now it's at 1/500th of a second right here. And you can also see the ISO jumped to 6400 because I have it on auto ISO. So now when I spin this, it should freeze the action. And if we hit the playback menu, you'll see, there it is, frozen. So now if we go to the previous image, you can see F11, 1 full second. Now this one, 1/500th of a second, F4. So that is how you can use shutter priority mode to freeze the action or get blurry photos. Now, of course, if you want blurry photos, you're really going to want it on a nice sturdy tripod here, and you're going to want to set the self timer as well, because any kind of camera movement will lead to the other stuff being blurry. So if you want to capture motion, you only want the stuff moving to be blurry in most cases, whether it's blurry water, streaking taillights, and so forth. So let's put it in aperture priority mode really quick. And now if we turn the rear dial now switched to the exposure comp, and the front dial is what controls the aperture. So the sub command dial is what's controlling aperture. See that? And it's automatically changing the ISO because we have it set to auto ISO is enabled. Also note right here how you can see the aperture there in aperture priority mode, and as I change it, that number is changing. You can see the F number there. Alright, so the aperture is controlling the aperture diaphragm, and what that is, it looks like a pupil inside the lens, and that's what the aperture controls. So the lower the number, right now it's at f5.6, the lower that number, the larger the aperture diaphragm is going to be. You can see here on my old school Minolta lens, the aperture diaphragm changing, right? So there's f16, then we're opening up the aperture. So this is going to be fast, wide open, f1.4. This is going to be a slow aperture, so this is going to be like f16 or whatever. So this would be stopping it down, this would be opening it up. This is another really nice lens I have, 35mm f0.95, and I just wanted to show you this one because this has a rounded aperture diaphragm. You can see it looks more round as opposed to the Minolta, which chopped down into like a pentagon or whatever. I have the 85mm lens here, and it's an f1.8 lens. So the max aperture number for this lens is going to be f1.8. With the lens that I'm using here, it's f5.6 at this zoom. So if I change this to 24mm, I could then lower the aperture to f4, because that is the max aperture for this lens at 24mm. But again, if I had the 85mm mounted, I could go as low as f1.8 here. Now, Aperture controls the size of the lens diaphragm, but it also controls depth of field. So the larger the aperture, the narrower the depth of field, or the more blurry the background is. So if you want blurry backgrounds, fast aperture lenses are going to be better for that purpose. So portrait lenses, for example, this 85mm f1.8 is perfect because it'll give you that killer background separation. I'll show you some sample photos, and the background just blurs out. Now, this lens is not going to be able to do that as good, but this lens has a zoom range of 24 all the way to 200, which is incredible versatility. So, you get something with this zoom lens, you get that crazy versatility. This lens is more of a specialty lens, optimized for like portraits, food photography, stuff like that, flowers and things. But this lens is kind of made for like doing everything. Now let me just switch lenses and show you a little more clearly how aperture priority works. Alright guys, so now I have it switched to aperture priority mode, and I just want to show you, now I'm using the 85mm f1.8 lens, and I actually have it at the minimum focus distance in regards to that quarter on the screen, which is kind of small looking at it from where you're looking at it, but check it out, I got it focused on the quarter, and again it's at f1.8. Now if I turn the sub command dial here, you can watch the aperture change. Now more importantly, watch the bokeh balls in the background change. Notice they're getting smaller because that is the depth of field changing as I change the aperture. So remember, the higher the aperture number, the more depth of field. So the less background blur. So let's move to manual mode here. So in manual mode, you have full control of the camera, and you can still use auto ISO in manual mode if you want to, just so you know, and it'll auto adjust for you, making it a lot easier to use. But by default, the front dial is going to be the aperture. So you could see the F number changing there. That's the front dial. And the rear dial is going to be shutter speed. And you can see the shutter speed changing there. So let me just hard set the ISO in the menu here so I can show you a little bit better how this works. Alright, so now I have the ISO hard set to 100, but I can change it by turning the dial here if I want. So now the ISO is basically controlled by this dial. I'm just going to lock it at 100 again. So you can see now the scene is underexposed a lot, and you can tell by the meter on the right hand side showing that it's underexposed. You see all those little dashes? So what I could do is I could slow the shutter speed down, and you can see how the exposure is coming back if you watch the meter. Every time I click, it's going up a line. See that? So we could set it to 1/5 of a second for a proper exposure if we want, but let's say we want it at 1/30th of a second. Now what we can do is we can raise the ISO. So let's raise the ISO, and same thing, you can see those lines clicking away as we click the ISO. So somewhere right around there. And you can see the exposure is looking balanced, it's at 0 now, and all we did was raise the ISO. So that's one way to do it. Now we can also change the aperture. So let's say we want this at f8. You see how it's a little bit darker? So we have two options to brighten the exposure. We can slow the shutter speed down and allow more time for light to gather. And watch, as we slow it down, the brighter the screen is getting. See that? So we're just allowing more time. The other option would be, if we put this back to 1/30th, would be to raise the ISO up more. So we can raise the ISO up all the way to there approximately, and that will be a proper exposure. The other thing we can do, if we lower the ISO, let's put it back at like 800 or 640, so you can see it's underexposed. So now we can open up the aperture, which is the lens diaphragm. So we're opening the pupil of the lens, and you can see as we open it, it's getting brighter. And right around there is a proper exposure. So that's how manual mode works. It gives you like full power of the camera. And you could use auto ISO, or you can set the ISO hard by using the dial up top, whichever way you like. Same thing with shutter priority mode. If you're in shutter priority mode, you could use the dial if you want, as opposed to the wheel on the back. It's up to you. I'm just so used to using the dials on the back, I tend to just do that by default. Alright, so let's go into the menu here. I just wanted to show you a couple of items. I'm just going to go over the main stuff that I think is important. File naming. This is cool. You can go in here and change the way that the file is named. You could see the examples there. So your secondary slot function would be if you're using dual cards. So you can set that for redundancy. You could set it for backup, so it'll be duplicated. You could set it so RAW or JPEG goes to the other card, for example. Lots of options there. Now image area, again, we'll put the camera into crop factor mode. Tone mode, you need a special TV or a monitor, HDR monitor if you want to use HLG mode. Image quality, I'm using RAW plus JPEG. RAW recording, if you want the best quality possible, you can change that to lossless here. The file sizes are much larger though at lossless. Now active dynamic lighting, you can turn that on and off. That will just help with the highlights and the shadows a little bit. It'll just try to balance them out a little bit better. Long exposure noise reduction is turned off for photos. I usually don't have that on. High ISO noise reduction is set to normal. You can turn that off or on as well, or you can dial it in. This stuff is all by default. Skin smoothing is a great option. Skin softening it's called here. And I really like using it. It's very helpful because it'll just make the skin look a little smoother. So your family members might appreciate it if you turn that on, especially the older ones. Portrait impression balance. This is an interesting feature. You can turn this on and then you have 3 different modes for when taking portraits. And if you do enable it, you could basically just use the directional pad to manipulate the different features that you have prioritized. So it's pretty cool if you're doing portraits. You can like easily manipulate the look of it just by touching the directional pad if you enable that feature. Photo flicker reduction. This is helpful if you're having those flickering lights and stuff. Metering mode. Matrix metering basically will use the entire sensor to try to figure out what the proper exposure is. Center weighted metering will prioritize the center of the screen or the sensor, and it'll use just that area to prioritize metering. Spot metering will use a very tiny little spot. So spot metering is just going to use the very center of the sensor, and you can see here now it's pretty much exposing for the background. That's why it went so bright like that. And now if I put it here, it's going to prioritize the face if it sees the face. But that's how spot metering works. It just uses a tiny little area for the exposure to meter. And the metering, again, is trying to figure out what proper exposure is. Now you can change this in the eye menu as well. If we go here, this is highlight priority. So this will prioritize the highlights. This is great for like white frothy water or like anything bright that you might be shooting, something white, you know, a light bulb, whatever. Highlight tone priority will make sure that those highlights are protected. And then if we put it back into matrix metering, you could see the whole scene is now like averaged out. Flash mode, if you're using a flash, you get flash compensation. Release mode, again, we already talked about that. That's single shot versus continuous. You can go in here and change it though. These are all the different options we talked about earlier. Hit that little button there to go back if you want. And we got autofocus area. All these settings that we saw in the eye menu are also in here in the menu. You can turn that on if you're using manual focus lenses. It's very helpful. Vibration reduction, you can go in here, you can turn it off, you can change it to sport mode if you want. So vibration reduction will basically, when this is turned on, it'll prioritize the focus point and try to make sure that that area is as stable as possible. It just prioritizes where you're focusing as to how the vibration reduction algorithm on this camera works. Pretty interesting feature. Auto bracketing, this is extremely powerful. You can go in here and turn it on, and this is how you would take multiple photos at different exposures. And you could use it for a number of options. So you could see here, auto exposure, but you can set it for white balance, you can set it for flash. This is the active dynamic range option. You can bracket with that as well. But basically what I would use if I was doing HDR photography is I would use the AE option. I would do like that. That's how I would have it set. 2 stops, 3 photos, and then I would turn this on. You have to go right or left to turn it on. See that? On. And now, you can see it took 3 different exposures there. So if I wanted to do that all at once, I can just go to the eye menu, and I can go to continuous, and you just hold it down and it's going to take all 3 bracketed shots. Or you can set the self timer. So if I go in here, set the self timer for like 2 seconds. So now I'm using bracketing with self timer. That's how you take HDR photos with a super stable camera. You're not pressing the shutter and moving it in between. So put it on single. If I go back into the menu here, we got auto bracketing on. You just go right or left to turn that off. But that's how I would recommend setting it for basic HDR. Now, of course, you could do more exposures or whatever you want to do. So multiple exposure, it basically creates like a composite image, and you can manipulate it using the different overlay modes. HDR overlay, this is basically auto HDR. So the camera will automatically take multiple exposures and combine them. And you can actually have it save the individual pictures as RAW files if you want, if you turn that feature on right there. See that? I highly recommend trying that and playing with it. Interval timer, and this is for interval shooting. So this is great for time lapses and stuff like that. And you can go in here and dial in the settings as you see fit. But basically you just got to go in there and you can hit start. And it's got a start date and time, interval, so it's 1 second intervals. How many shots is it going to take? Electronic shutter. You can have it focus before each shot if you want to. Let's go back. Time-lapse video. So you can go in here and you can do a time-lapse video, and this is where you can go and set the different settings. The camera will do all the work for you, which is very nice. Makes it nice and easy. Let's go back. So focus shift shooting is great for focus stacking if you're doing macro photography. Basically, you'll set where you start and it'll keep taking photos all the way to infinity focus, however many shots is required. And you can go in here and again, set the number of shots, focus step width, all sorts of stuff like that. So pixel shift shooting is that super high resolution mode. So you can go in here and you can turn it on, you can set the number of shots, and you can combine all these images on the computer and get a ridiculously high resolution image. So that's what that feature is for. And that's the end of the photo menu. So if we go into video, I'm just going to switch the camera to video mode. Menu. So very similar to the photo menu here, it's just specialized and optimized for video, which I like. I like having the separate menus. It makes it way easier to find what you're looking for. But notice how you have a lot of the same features, you know, file naming and so forth, destination, image area if you want to switch it to crop mode. You got ISO settings, white balance, picture control, a lot of the same stuff for photo mode. You got skin softening again, there you go. Portrait impression balance, you have that feature in here as well. Video flicker reduction, it's set to auto by default. You got the metering mode, focus mode, full-time autofocus is what AFF stands for. I recommend just leaving it there. Autofocus area, I'm going to change that to auto area AF, so it's using the whole area. Now we got autofocus detection here. I'm just going to switch this to people only, because I noticed the camera was picking up some other stuff when I just want to limit it to people. Vibration reduction is turned on, and if you go in there, one of the options is actually to have it set the same as the photo settings, which is pretty cool. So, or you could just set video to sport mode if you want, you know, just default it to that. Now this is a more advanced vibration stabilization. It's like extra, you can enable it here, but it will crop in. So if I go, for example, just looking at it, if I go to the eye menu here, so right here is the electronic vibration option. So if you turn it on, you see how it crops in? So that's what it does. It crops in on the sensor a little bit, but it'll give you better stabilization, especially if hand holding while walking, for example. I'm just going to turn it off for now. So there's two separate stabilization options in here. You got the digital, and then you have the actual, you know, sensor stab and the lens stabilization if the lens offers it. Also note you have the option for wind noise reduction in the video eye menu. Microphone sensitivity, you could just dial in the microphone there. These are microphone options here. I'm just leaving this stuff all at default. Mic jack plug-in power is set to on. You can turn time code on if you're using, you know, this camera in like a movie type situation where everyone's using time code. All right, guys, so now we're in the custom settings area, and it looks like the pencil over here. And this is very deep. There's so much options in this camera that it's a little bit overwhelming. So I'm not going to go over everything, guys. I'm just going to go through it pretty quick. And I'm going to point out some of the stuff that I think you should pay attention to if you need to change those settings depending on what you're doing. You should already have a really good idea on how to use this camera at this point. But again, this is getting a little bit deeper into the menu. So let me just go through here. No. So focus, if we go over to the right, these are all the different focus options. And like I said, this camera has so much power, it is remarkable. So you have different autofocus priority selection options. So you can have it set to release, it's referring to the shutter button, or focus, so you can prioritize what what the release is doing as far as autofocus continuous. Now we have autofocus single shot. You can set it to the focus point or when you release the shutter. Those are your options there. Focus tracking with lock on. You can change this if you want, delayed or quick. Focus points used, you can actually limit the number of focus points so you don't see so many of them on the screen and stuff like that. It's just one of those options in here. You can store points by orientation. What that means is horizontal versus vertical. So you can go in here and you can change the amount of autofocus areas that show up when you go into the autofocus area option from the eye menu, for example. So you can see how they're all checked. You can actually turn some of this stuff off if you want. That's what that's referring to. Let's go back. Focus point wrap around, you might remember it from your DSLR camera. That's how it used to work with DSLRs back in the day with the phase detection. Autofocus point display, that's turned on by default. Autofocus continuous, I'm going to turn that on also, so this way you can see when you're in autofocus continuous what it's actually tracking. Sometimes it's really hard to tell. Autofocus assist illuminator, that's the light here. It'll light up in low light situations. That's on by default. Focus peaking is that overlay that shows up when using manual focus. It's a nice tool for video. When using manual focus lenses, focus peaking will actually, it'll light up a color where the focus is, and it'll help you like see where the focus is. All right, so here's focus peaking. You can turn that on right here. Set to red. So now when I turn the focus, you'll see, notice how the red is lighting up on the corner? That is focus peaking. So it'll tell you when you have the subject in focus. And you can also look down on the bottom left for that manual focus indicator. When there's a circle, that's when you know you got it. So that's how focus peaking works. And you can change the color of it and stuff as well. In here, notice how it's set to red. You got yellow, blue, white, and so forth. All right, so now we're in metering and exposure. So you can see if we go out one, we're now in B. If we go over one, you can see we're in B. So it's just going to continue to go through all the settings if we just keep going down. So you can change your ISO step value. By default, it is 1/3 of a stop, but you can make it 1 full stop if you want. Some people prefer that. Matrix metering face detection. So that's on. What that means is it's going to prioritize the face when using the matrix metering. So that's, remember, the whole sensor is matrix metering with a little bit of a priority in the center. But if it sees a face in there, it's going to prioritize the face. So that's what this is. I recommend leaving it on. But if you're wondering, why the exposure is not changing when you're moving the camera around, if it sees a face, it's going to prioritize that face and try to lock the exposure for the face. Now, you remember how I said the center weight average metering uses the center area. Now, here it's asking you how much. Do you want the average, small, standard? So I'm just going to leave that at default. So again, you can just fine tune the metering mode. Crazy power on this camera. All right, so now we're on C here. Shutter release button, auto exposure lock. It's set to off by default. Now you might want to enable this. So what it'll do is it'll lock the exposure when you have this shutter button half pressed. Like when I'm pressing it like this, the exposure will be locked. And that's what that feature does. You can also make it so it stays locked during the burst mode. So if you take the burst, the exposure is not going to change during that burst. So self-timer here. It's just giving you the options for self-timer. You can actually change how much time there is between each self-timer shot. I like that. Power off delay. This is a really good feature. If you are using the camera and you don't want the screen to turn off, you can make these numbers longer. So by default, the camera will just turn off to save the battery life. Again, you can manipulate that stuff in here. All right, so this is the continuous low mode shooting speed, and I showed you this in the eye menu, but if you go to the right, you can actually change how many shots per second in this mode if you want to. Max burst shots, 200, you can change that. You can lower it, 200 is the maximum. Pre-release capture, this is an awesome feature, and what it does is it'll utilize the camera buffer if you have this enabled, and it'll, depending on how much time you have set here, it'll actually capture images before you take them. So when you press the shutter and start taking photos, it'll like go back in time and it'll take, whatever, the shots before that you never even took. It's called pre-burst. It's great for example, if you're filming birds or shooting birds in a tree and you want to get the bird like just leaving the nest, so you're just waiting, and then when the bird actually takes flight, you hit the shutter button down and it'll get like the 10 shots before that. so you'll actually get it leaving the nest sort of thing. This is great for if your kid's going to kick a soccer ball or hit a baseball bat or a softball. You get it going, you see the pitch coming, you can actually wait to when your kid hits the ball, for example, and then start shooting, and you'll get the shots before, like the whole swing and everything. This is a pretty advanced feature if using multiple cameras. You can actually sync the shutters up. Now here is the shutter option. So you have mechanical shutter, electronic front curtain, and auto. I recommend just leaving it on auto for the most part, but that's where you can go to change that if you need to. Extended shutter speeds in manual mode. You can enable this here. So this will allow you to set it from a minimum of 30 seconds all the way up to 900 seconds. So that's a pretty powerful feature there. And again, if you hit the zoom out on the back of the camera, it's also the question mark. It'll give you more information. That's what I just hit there. So this is where you can go and you can set the formats if you want. These are the different options. You have crop factor 1:1 or 16:9. File number sequence, I recommend leaving that on. Starlight view. Now this is for astrophotography, and if you enable it, it'll make the screen a little bit easier to see. So you could use this anytime, but it's particularly useful for astrophotography. So warm display colors, you can actually enable this, and in lower light situations, it'll just warm things up. View all in continuous mode, I'm gonna leave that on. Default, image frame, default, grid type. This is where you can go and you can change the different grids. Virtual horizon, a couple different options here. You got this option here or this option. I prefer type A. This is where you can go and you can customize what is viewed on the display when you hit the display button and cycle through. So these are the different displays. I can turn off this one, for example. I could uncheck it or whatever. Or this one I could uncheck because I know I never use it, for example. Now this is for the viewfinder, so it's referring to the actual viewfinder this time, and you could change the display of the viewfinder as well. Now we're into flash sync speed. You can go in here if you guys are doing flash photography. Bunch of stuff for that. Auto flash ISO control, modeling flash is set to on by default. This is flash bracketing, bracketing order, flash burst priority. Now here we have customized the I menu. So notice we're in the F1. If we go down, we're in the controls now. I'm just going back to the left. So we're in the pencil and we're in F for controls. And customize the I menu. So we can go in here and change this. Like if I'm never gonna use picture control, for example, I can change it to ISO if I want. There's a bunch of different options in here I could change it to. I could put skin smoothing in there. Let's just put skin smoothing in there. That's pretty much how you do it. So then you got the quality, size, which is gonna relate to both photo and video. The custom controls option, I can change that to something if I want. Metering, you got airplane mode. If you never use airplane mode, you can use that slot for something else. So here we are in the video customize area, and I could go in here and customize the I menu if I want. These are the options in here. And you can see I can set this to, let's put it at skin softening or something. So now we have skin softening enabled. Now custom controls is where you can go and change the custom controls. Focus point lock, I'm going to leave that off. Limited AF area mode selection. This is where you can go and you could limit the area modes if you choose to. Autofocus speed. Now this is a very powerful feature. This is your autofocus speed, so you can make it slower if you want, and it's very helpful in certain situations, and faster if you're trying to track a moving subject like sports, somebody running towards you or whatever. So another cool thing about autofocus speed is if you're doing focus transitions from like a subject to the background and so forth, you can make that really slow, and it'll be a nice slow transition speed. Now tracking sensitivity, this is how likely it is to switch from one subject to another. So if you want it very sensitive, set it to high. If you want it more locked on stuff, I would set it to low, and it'll be less likely to switch subjects. Now here's some power zoom options if you're using power zoom lenses, which I don't have, but there's options in the menu for that. Zebra is a very helpful tool for exposing when using log, in particular log shooting formats, because the image is a lot flatter and it's harder to tell what the exposure is. And that's what View Assistant is as well. It'll help with that. You got grid, brightness information, histogram. So you can change your histogram into waveforms. This is where you can change it like this. I have a large waveform box, which is very helpful for video. So you can change the shooting display. That's just what you're gonna see on the screen if you want. You can dial that in. Same thing with the viewfinder. Record frame display. That's when the whole screen has that rectangle on it when you start recording. And now we're back to A1. So if we go down into the playback area here, you can see we're in the playback area now. These are all the different options for playback. So you got delete, you could select pictures, delete them, organize them. You can limit the playback folder if you want. You can change what is displayed as far as focus point. I like to have the focus point displayed. And then if you're shooting groups of photos, burst shooting, it'll mark the first shot in a series, which is very helpful. I also want the exposure information. And now if we go back into the play menu here, and I select an image, let's just select that one. Let's zoom out and cycle through the display options. So now, if we hit the display button, you can see the exposure information. Before, that wasn't an option. So you could just see this, and you didn't really know how the camera was set. So now that we have that set, we can see the option here. And that's where it is, playback display options. So highly recommend checking the ones that I have checked, but you can add more if you want. You can have all sorts of information in there. Delete pictures from both slots. Picture review, if you have that enabled, when you take a photo, it'll show up on the screen for like 2 seconds by default, right? It'll show up on the monitor. And you might be used to point and shoot cameras. A lot of them, by default, when you take a photo, it'll come up on the screen for like 2 seconds. That's picture review, so you can enable that there. Auto rotate pictures, that's horizontal and vertical. It'll just auto rotate for you. And that's it for the playback menu. So if we go into the setup menu here, this is where you can go to format your memory card. You got your language option, time zone, monitor brightness. Again, very important for when you're outside and you need a bright screen. You got monitor color balance, viewfinder brightness, so you can change the brightness of the viewfinder as well. And you got color balance for the viewfinder. So the finder display size. So when you're looking through the viewfinder, you can actually change the size of it. You can make it a little bit smaller if you want by changing it to small. This is useful if you set it to small, like if you have glasses and you're a little bit further from the viewfinder, you can't see the edges of the viewfinder sometimes, like because you can't get your eye right up there. You can make it smaller and it'll actually make the screen smaller so it's a little easier to see the viewfinder from like a little bit further away. That's what that feature is, and it's very useful for somebody that has glasses on like me. Autofocus fine-tuning options. You can go in here and you can fine-tune for specific lenses if you want to. That will be helpful. Sometimes lenses will front focus or rear focus. That's where you can go and dial that stuff in. You can save focus positions if you want. Save zoom positions if you want. Auto temperature cutout, I like to have that set for high, and the camera will record longer before it overheats. You could record for a long time, but in 4K 60, it's going to get pretty hot. You can clean the image sensor in here if you want. It'll just like shake it. You can set it to automatic cleaning if you want as well. So when you turn the camera off, it'll like auto clean. You can do the reference photo for dust on the sensor if you need to. Pixel mapping will check for dead pixels and stuff. So you can do that every once in a while as a maintenance thing. Image comment, you can add comments to images. It's pretty amazing. Copyright information, so you can go in here and you can add copyright information and it'll automatically embed it into your photos. Voice memos, you can go in here. You got a voice memo option, voice memo control. Camera sounds, beep is off by default, but you can turn that on and it'll beep when you start focusing and stuff. Like watch, hear that? So that's off by default because it's annoying. So I recommend leaving it off, but if you need it on, that's where you can go to turn it on. So here's silent mode. You can enable that right here if you want. The camera's pretty quiet as it is, but if you went perfectly silent, that's where that is. Touch controls. This is where you can turn the touch controls on and off, and you also have a glove mode. So if you're out in the freezing cold and you're like fat fingering it with gloves, you can turn it on and it'll adjust the sensitivity for you and make it a little easier. Self-portrait mode, you can turn that on and off. That's where this feature is. So when you have the camera in self-portrait mode, it actually behaves a little bit differently because it assumes you're using it in selfie mode. So you might want to turn that off. I turned it off because I prefer having full power when in selfie mode, but it'll automatically put a self timer on there and a couple other things. It's on by default when I first booted this camera up, just so you guys know. Here's your HDMI settings. USB connection priority. You can just default that to different options if you want. Battery info, power delivery, I have that turned on. Energy saving photo mode, you might want to turn that on. It'll just shut the camera down quicker so the battery is less likely to, slowly drain if you're just like farting around or whatever. Now this slot empty release lock. So this basically means the camera will take photos without a memory card in there. You may or may not want to do that. So you can turn that off if you want here. So this way you don't accidentally start taking photos with no memory card. It's up to you. This is where you can save and load menu settings. So once you get your camera configured exactly how you want, you can save it to the memory card and then upload it to another camera, and all the settings will just copy over. Reset all settings. This should set the camera back to factory default, but it doesn't seem to do that because the time was still set on mine. Now, firmware version, this is currently at firmware version 1.10, in case you guys are wondering, just so you know where this camera is at the time of this tutorial. We scroll down, we have network options. Now, this is where you can put it in airplane mode, connect to smart device. This is all that stuff is in here. Wireless modes, connect to computer, connect to FTP server, other cameras, Atmos, Air, Glue, Bluetooth options, USB options. You got router frequency band options and MAC address. All that stuff's in there. Now down here is my menu. This is a great spot because in here is where you can go and add items. So if I want to add items from the shooting menu, for example, I can just keep going to the right and I can scroll down. So I'm going to do ISO sensitivity settings. I'm going to add that. And if we go back, you can see it's right at the top. So we got ISO sensitivity settings. I can go in there and turn off auto ISO really easy now if I want to. And that's pretty much how that works. Like I said, I didn't go over every single feature in the menu there, but I went over most of them just to really give you an idea on how to really harness the power of this incredible camera. All right, guys, so get out there, start taking some photos, taking some video with your awesome Nikon ZF. And if you have any questions, please feel free to comment in the comment section below. I also included a couple of links for a few accessories that I think are like must-haves, particularly the grip. You really got to get a grip for this. I think it's just too hard to hold this camera with the limited grip. It's just too heavy. All right, guys, that about wraps up this video. I will catch up with you next time. Take care.